is actually our program coordinator. So rather than having Sarah having to introduce herself, I've asked Dave if he would have the honor of introducing Sarah for our program. Dave?
I think you just did it, John. My name is Dave Rucker, and as John said, Sarah Miller sets up all these programs and organizes them and coordinates them, so thank her for that. It's a big job. And today she is going to present us with the story of Oregon statehood. Welcome, Sarah. Wrong coffee shop.
We'll get it in.
So, I'm a lifelong Oregonian, and somehow when I went to school here in Oregon, I did third grade history twice, so I don't remember doing the Oregon statehood stuff. So some of the stuff might be common knowledge, but some of it might not, and it was all new information for me. So I went to go read all the answers to some of the trivia questions about what is the state bird, the state song, the state motto. Even some of the more obscure trivia questions like, what is the state crustacean, the state drink, and the state dirt? If you don't know the answer to those, then the state bird is the western meadowlark. The song is Oregon, my Oregon. The motto is Alles Vole Propitious. She flies with her own wings. The state crustacean is the Dungeness crab. The state drink is milk. The state dirt is Jory soil. All of these trivia are kind of commonly talked about. And the trivia that Oregon became a state on February 4th, 1859 is also common knowledge. But what did it take to become a state? And why did we become a state on that particular day? That was the question I sought out the answer in the Oregon Historical Society in their records. Their records don't go back to 1859. I had to look into the newspaper files from the Oregon Centennial and from the Oregon Sesquicentennial, because they had some reflective articles that had sources that we no longer have. I also went down to the state archives, where all of the papers from the state legislature resides in Salem. They also didn't have records from 1859, because we apparently had 2 Capitol fires in the 157 years since, and so some of those early records are lost. So I had to go and figure out just what I could find. And we know from government or civics classes in school that to become a state, you have to become a territory. Oregon Territory was established officially on August 14th, 1848, with the capital at Oregon City. Then after being a territory, the population needs to make it known to that they favor statehood, and this is usually done by referendum. Well, the Oregon Territory was not different from Oregon State. As a state, the territory legislature debated and voted 9 times about statehood. 8 times failed. They referred it to the popular vote 4 separate times before we finally voted to become a state. The first one was June 5th, 1854. It was defeated by 869 votes. The second one was June 4th, 1855, losing by 415 votes. The source I had didn't tell me which date in April, but April 1856, it was the popular vote for the question of statehood. It was defeated by 249 votes. Finally, the vote in June of 1857, it was 7,617 for statehood against 1,679. And so finally, in 1857, the voters of the state of Oregon, which at that time were white males who owned property, finally said, yes, we want to become a state.
This look pretty good.
The next step after the popular vote was to write a state constitution. The Constitutional Convention convened at the courthouse in Salem starting August 17th, 1857, and was adjourned, as they say, sine die, on September 18th of that year. Sine die means that they don't have another meeting date planned, but they're not dissolving the body. so that if something should happen and they needed to be recalled, they could. It was a legislature term that I thought was an interesting manner of saying, we've completed our work, but we're not going completely away. The new Oregon State Constitution was approved by the popular vote of 7,195 for and 3,215 against on November 9th, 1857. And you think we're doing pretty good. We've got a state constitution. That's when it goes to Washington, D.C. to be debated, because the U.S. Congress has to put their seal of approval on any state constitution. While waiting for word from Washington, D.C., Oregon had elections, their normal elections come around in 1858, for both the territorial and state leadership. We elected both a territorial governor and a state governor in the same election. We did the same for our our representative to the U.S. Congress. We elected a territorial delegate and 2 senators and a U.S. House of Representative member on the fact that we were sure we were going to become a state. So we elected a state legislature and a territorial legislature. So there was a little bit of confusion in 1858 about just who was in charge of the state. And the state legislature met for the first time, and this is not, they don't record this in the official meetings of the Oregon State Legislature, on July 5th, 1858. The legislature at that time elected Joseph Lane and Delazon Smith as U.S. senators, and Lafayette Grover as U.S. State Representative. As Lane was already in Washington, D.C. as our territorial representative, the other 2 went out and joined him and campaigned for the Oregon Constitution to be approved and us to become a state. The state governor, John Whittaker, was sworn in on July 8th, 1858, and had a speech which I will read the first 2 or couple sentences to. You are assembled here today under the provisions of the fundamental law of the state. The people by their own act called a convention. That convention framed a constitution. The people ratified it. And today we put on the habiliments of a full-grown man and emerge from territorial vassalage into a state sovereignty. It is worthy to note that while the people of Oregon were preparing for a state organization, the government of the United States was menaced and greatly imperiled by the acts of a sister territory, Kansas, while framing itself for a constitution preparatory to entering the Union. It was a matter of gratification that no such lawless conduct or violation of rights characterized the people of our young and fair state, while preparing to become one of the members of this great confederacy. It is the attribute to the fact that Oregon was peopled by a high order of citizens, a people possessing a due sense of their moral and political duties to themselves in the spirit of forbearance toward one another. The transition from territorial existence to that of state sovereignty is always attended with more or less disorder and delay. But when we consider the change that Oregon has passed through, the people, when but a handful, organized and successfully maintained a provisional government, which the government was superseded by an organic act, and General Lane sent here as our first governor, the people readily accommodated themselves to the governor and his authority. Now they declare they are ready for another change and assume state sovereignty. This is while we were still technically a territory. He's declaring us a state. So there was a bit of confusion. Eventually, after 2 or 3 days, the state legislature realized we're not actually a state. We don't have any authority. And they decided they would go home and let the territorial legislature have prominence. Meanwhile, back in Washington, the debate raged on. The Senate had referred the bill to the House on May 19th, 1858. So the Senate quickly approved our state constitution and said, yeah, we approve, they'll become a state. Now it's the House's turn to decide. It was referred to the House Committee on Territories on June 5th, 1858. They debated, and they debated. On February 10th, 1859, they finally got that Committee on Territories to report back to the full House. And they didn't recommend statehood because they doubted that there was sufficient population. Because the thing with the kerfluffle with Kansas had established you needed so many people to become a state. And Kansas didn't have that numbers, and they didn't think Oregon had that numbers. The Delegate Lane, the delegate to the House of Representatives, who would be a state senator the moment we became a state, said that population is nearly 93,000. That's close enough to the 100,000 you want. But that was twice the number that like the Statesman Journal had estimated for the Oregon. And although the 93,000 number was the number that had been referred to the House Committee on Territories in December. So they're going, okay. As an interesting side note, the census in 1860 in Oregon had our population at 52,405. So the bill did eventually get to the House floor on February 11th, 1859. It was debated, and it was debated. The major cause of conflict is something that a lot of people don't like to talk about in the state of Oregon, and that was the anti-Negro clause in our Constitution. There were three major factors in the state at the time. One was we wanted us to be a free state. One of the factors wanted us to be a slave state. The third factor didn't really care, they just didn't want Negroes in the state. So they compromised and put a clause into our state constitution that said, we will be neither free nor slave, but Negroes are not allowed within the borders of the state of Oregon. This caused various abolitionists from the north to object because of the injustice of a constitution that discriminated against a whole class born on American soil. The other side we were seen mostly as a neutral state. So the sides wanting more free states, we're not a free state, so the free states don't get the balance of power. And we're not a slave state, so the slave states didn't get a balance of power. One of the major people behind making sure that we became a state was a guy named Alexander Stephens, representative of Georgia. He would later become Vice President Stephens of the Confederate States of America. And eventually, the House passed the bill late on February 11th, 1859, the vote was 114 to 103. We got statehood by 11 representatives. That night, there was a celebration in Washington for the 33rd state. So you could kind of argue that our statehood birthday should be February 11th. The celebration was so large that they got the Marine Band to join the large concourse of citizens, and that's a quote from the New York Herald of the time. And they serenaded 10 of the congressmen, including General Lane and Stephens, who had led the fight. Each of the serenaded congressmen then had to make a speech in appreciation for the serenade from the Marine Band. And then they joined the party and they kept marching through Washington until they wound up at the lawn of the White House. And they called for the president to come out and say something. And they called for the president to come out and say something. And eventually President James Buchanan opened up a window and said, and this is according to the quote from an article in the Oregonian that quoted the New York Herald of the time, that he presumed, he said, from this handsome demonstration that the Oregon bill had passed. He sincerely congratulated them upon the advent of another sovereign state into the glorious confederacy of the republics. A state, too, situated on the very shore of the Pacific, favored with a fine climate and an exuberant soil, and filled with tried and noble Democrats. Buchanan was a Democrat. There were some more speeches, and the president requested the Marine Band to play Yankee Doodle. And then eventually everybody dispersed after the Marine Band plays Yankee Doodle. And Senators Joseph Lane and Delazon Smith were sworn in and took their places in the United States Senate on February 13th. On February 14th, Representative Lafayette Grover was sworn into the United States House. It was also that day that President Buchanan signed the bill into law. But was that the end of it? February 14th, 1859, we're a state. But does anybody in Oregon know about it? That was before the Pony Express, before the railroad got this far. So it took them another 29 days to tell Oregon that we were a state and that we had been for about a month. The message took the train to St. Joseph, then one guy took it overland to San Francisco, and then it got put on a steamship called the Brother Jonathan from the San Francisco up to Oregon, and then it got given to another guy, and I forget his name, who rode 36 hours through the rain and mud and things to Salem to finally tell Governor Whittaker that he was indeed actually Governor Whittaker this time. And so on April 4th, was middle of March when we finally got word that we were a state. On April 4th, the governor of Oregon put a proclamation into newsletters, and it said, whereas satisfactory information has received by me of the admission of the state of Oregon into the Union and on equal footing with the original states, and appearing that the immediate legislation be necessary to complete the state organization. Therefore I, John Whittaker, Governor of the State of Oregon, publish this, my proclamation calling upon the members of the Legislative Assembly to convene at the seat of government of said state on Monday, the 16th of May, 1859, and there hold an extra session of the Legislature and take such action as may be deemed as expedient. In testimony whereof I have hereunto signed my name this 4th day of April, 1859, John Whittaker. And with that, our state legislature actually convened. My personal opinion on this is whether Valentine's Day is a good day to celebrate Oregon, because we could celebrate on the 11th. We could celebrate on the 12th when we had senators. We could celebrate, or 13th when we had senators. We could celebrate, any of these 4 days you can choose to celebrate the state of Oregon. I think they waited, because President Buchanan could have signed it into law on the 12th or the 13th, but he waited till the 14th. I think they wanted to give us a day that we could easily remember as an admission of statehood.
They were Democrats.
I don't know, but there was, so it seemed to me that there was somewhat of a choice of date that we got, and I think February 14th is fabulous that we are one of the Valentine states to the Union. So happy 157th birthday, Oregon. So any questions?
I would like to make a comment in regards to the Negro question. There were Oregon pioneers that brought their slaves with them.
Right.
So up until we became a state, nothing was really officially done.
Right.
And one particular case in Polk County, it was a husband and a wife Negro couple with little children. So they challenged the Constitution and the court system. They wanted to be free because we weren't a slave state.
Right.
Well, the owner of the slave said the parents could go, but they were keeping the children. So then there was more court cases. Finally, the children were able to go with the parents.
Yeah. Yeah, it was very, very nasty, the whole slave Negro question. It just...
And that was just one case. There were other cases too.
No one changed when we were allowed to have that.
I think it was mostly done when it was changed at the federal level. I have recently heard that Oregon, when that first,
Emancipation
when the amendment to the Constitution happened for the blacks, that Oregon didn't ratify it because you only needed 2/3 of the states to ratify it, and Oregon just sort of ratified it by non-vote. But I do think we have since, and that, like within the last 20 years, have gone back and actually officially ratified that thing. And the language has been struck out of our Constitution for quite some time, but it was there in the first draft, and it nearly denied us statehood because of the tensions on that issue. No matter what way we would have gone on that, would have had problems. A lot of people also thought, because of the people who had been cheerleading us were solid Southerners, they thought when the Confederacy happened, they thought we would have gone as a Confederate state. No, that's when we changed our motto from "She flies with her own wings" to "the Union," and we were stayed with the Union because it was a Civil War thing and as a declaration of where we were. Even though they had asked for Oregon militia troops, and the official statement from the state of Oregon is, "We are so far away from the battlefield that our troops won't get to you in time to help you, so no, we're not going to send any to you, but we won't leave leave the Union either." So Oregon tried its darndest to stay out of that. And it was not until the 1852 or 1952 when we changed back to "She flies with her own wings" as the motto, which is why on the state flag and the state seal it still says "the Union." So.
I wanted to say, in Benton County where we were living, the first free slave lived on the property next to ours, joining us there outside of Corvallis. And actually, the old remains of his house was all covered in blackberries, and the new people, it was turned into a chicken house. And don't you remember you kids playing in that? Yeah, Bill and all of them played in and out of there in that. But that's where the first free slave lived. And the cemetery, the Union Cemetery up there, he is buried up there in that cemetery. There's no marker, but he is buried up there in the Union Cemetery there.
And you said you found?
Yeah, I wanted to see when it was eliminated. It says that the clause was never enforced, although several attempts were made by the legislature to pass an enforcement law. In 1865, the legislature rejected a proposal for a county-by-county census law that could have authorized the sheriffs to deport them. Anyway, a Senate committee killed the last attempt in 1866. The clause was removed by the 14th Amendment, but it was not repealed until 1926. I was thinking it was in the 20s, but I wasn't sure.
Yeah, so the clause stayed in until into the 20th century.
Then it says other racist language in the state constitution was removed in 2002.
Yeah. So that was kind of interesting. I don't think I'd actually heard about the whole racist clause until I started digging into this and digging into why did it take, the Senate got it done in July of 1858, why did it take them another 8 months to get it past the House, and then turns out there was a very good reason for that.
Why did it take 4 years to even get up to the point of establishing the board?
The other part of it was that some of them wanted to establish the boundary, the eastern boundary of the state of Oregon at the Cascades, and that this is where the U.S. Congress wanted to establish it, and they said, no, let the Oregonians say where their boundary is, and the Oregonians said they're at the Hells Canyon, Idaho border. Snake River, yeah.
Wow.
So it was just all sorts of fascinating little.
And the government said, okay, well, we'll take it anyway. They almost.
Yeah.
They claimed most of it.
Thank you very much, Sarah. I think it's listening to all that, it's the one if we ever became a state at any date. I think that concludes our program and concludes our meeting for today.
I have the name of the next month's speaker.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Karen Huntsberger is going to be our speaker next month, talking about her uncle's service in World War II. So.
Okay. Thank you, Sarah. So hopefully we'll see you all again a month from now, and Also, if you wish, it'd be very much appreciated. Why don't you all try to bring a visitor with you? And we'll get this place really filled up, and we'll move out into the bigger room. Thank you very much.